Good morning to all of you and happy Easter. I don't think I need to say this out loud, but Easter is definitely different this year, right? If we were living in ordinary times, our celebrations today would have been communal and festive. A group of us would have gathered at the church as the sun rose to welcome in this day during our sunrise service. And then we would have gathered at the table for a hot Easter breakfast. Our church would have been filled with energy as our children gathered for an Easter program. And then we would sit with our families in celebration during our 10:15 service, listening to our mighty choir and bells and trumpets. We would have been surrounded by beauty, surrounded by the smell of blooming lilies, and the celebrations and gatherings would have continued late into the day. Most importantly, we would have lived out our traditions together, gathered at church and then with our family and friends in our homes to celebrate the best and boldest news ever told. The tomb is empty. Death is undone. Christ is risen. He has risen indeed. But not this year. I'm recording this sermon by myself in my dining room, while most of you listen at home, some of you alone. In all truthfulness, it's hard for me to sing and to shout the hallelujahs. This year, it's harder for me to get into the Easter feeling, to be able to proclaim that Christ is truly risen. How can we celebrate resurrection when there is mass death all around us? When people are dying by the thousands every day, with all the fear and anxiety and worry and struggle. In the words of Debbie Thomas, what good can it do to insist that the tomb is empty when body bags are in short supply, when mortuaries are at capacity, and mourners can't even gather to bury their dead? In reality, it seems like hope and new life and resurrection are something worth revisiting in July or August or September or whenever this mess is behind us and we finally have that promised vaccine. Then we can celebrate. But until then, how do we take seriously the present reality and at the same time preach an honest resurrection? I'll start by honestly saying, I don't know. At this moment, I begin by saying I don't know because it's the most honest thing I can say. I don't know. I'm grieving. I'm bewildered. I'm struggling. And yes, I believe with all my heart that Christ is risen, and that his rising was and is radically consequential, that his resurrection brought new life and opportunity and completely stood in defiance to all that was impossible. But today I'm still fumbling. As I've struggled with this question this week of how to preach the resurrection without leaving our current reality behind, I've been led to pay closer attention to the very first Easter, to stay close to the original story that we find in our Gospels. As mentioned before, our Easters are usually filled with elation, with joy and celebration. We gather to hear the trumpets and brass, to smell the lilies, and to enjoy a breakfast together. We gather to sing our Alleluias. Our day is filled with family gatherings and yummy meals. And if there are kids around, some Easter eggs and baskets are to be found. But you know what? The very first Easter was nothing like that. Instead, when I read our John retelling of the first Easter, I see messiness. I see chaos. I see a barely comprehensible Easter story. There are scattered grave cloths. There's confused running. There's timid peeks into an empty tomb. There are tears and more tears. Now this sounds more like our current reality, right? So let's lean in a little closer. One of the things that stuck out to me in John that is unique in comparison to the other gospel accounts is that in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb early in the morning while it is still dark. So while it is still dark, Mary finds the stone rolled away. While it is still dark, Mary summons Simon Peter and the beloved disciple. While it is still dark, Jesus' body is missing, but the linens still remain. While it is still dark, the resurrection happens. A new day has not yet dawned. The realities of death and grief and confusion and pain still linger. And yet, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all of the uncertainty and doubt and even death itself, the resurrection happens. Jesus was dead. The tomb had been sealed. Guards stood watch. This wasn't supposed to happen, but the resurrection happened anyway. It was in the midst of the confusion, in the grief, that the first Easter happens. I don't know about you, but I find comfort in that. In all of the confusion and struggle and grief of today, when all hope seems lost, Easter comes anyway. The resurrection is still proclaimed today. God is present in all of this. The Spirit is still moving and working in this world. And you know, my eyes may still be too tired to recognize it or too swollen at times from all of my tears to see all of it. But today reminds me that what I see around me, what we are experiencing in this world, is not the end of the story. This Easter day reminds me to keep watch, for there are resurrection stories happening all around us, even in the continued darkness and confusion. And you know what? God is persistent in all of this. Another thing that stuck out to me in John is God's persistence. When Mary Magdalene returned to the tomb and was overcome by grief, her tears seemed to inhibit her from perceiving the news of this resurrection. It takes two angels, a verbal sparring with the resurrected Jesus, before, upon hearing her name, she finally realizes the power of resurrection in her midst. There is a persistence in this story. The resurrection is not only an act of defiance in the powers of death and evil, but also the resurrection persists even when unrecognized. The resurrected Christ tries again and again to reveal life-giving power to us, even if in our lives the new day has not yet dawned and we are struggling to merge out of those hours of death and grief and confusion. Even if we struggle in finding joy today, or experiencing the good news of the resurrection, or can even seem to find God in the midst of our grief, our Easter story reminds us that God is persistent and will try again and again to comfort and to heal and to reveal life-giving, life-changing power to us. In all the resurrection accounts that we find in the Gospels, I am comforted as I realize that these short accounts of confusion and grief are not the end of the story. We gather on Easter today, although not in the fashion that we would like, but we gather to remember and to proclaim that what we are experiencing now is not the end of the story. God is persistent. We will gather again in person. We will be comforted. There will be healing. Lives will change. Our world will come out better. I believe the persistence of God is already shining through. I've spoken with many of you over the last few weeks, checking in, asking if you need anything or if there are ways that we can support you. And almost every time you turn it around and ask me, how can we help? Does anyone need groceries or help getting their meds? Does anyone need food? I'm witnessing incredible kindness like sidewalk chalk, messages of hope and rainbows hung in neighbors' windows with words, "We will get through this." My Facebook feed is filled with ideas for how to support small businesses and cheer up kids at home who are missing their school friends. This crisis is bringing some of the weakest parts of our society to the forefront. Our inequalities, the despairs, the insecurities. This crisis has reminded us how many individuals are just one missed paycheck away from losing everything, or that too many of our children only eat when they are at school, or how this crisis is shining a spotlight on the oppression and racism and classism in our country. These are not things to celebrate, but as they are revealed and they are lifted up, we have the opportunity to change these things around, to seriously address these realities, to make the choice to not go back to how it was. We've all seen the pictures of LA and China with the clearest, healthiest air in decades. They say you can hear the birds sing on Madison Ave. From surprised birthday singing drive-by parades, to people being fed, to frontline workers getting up every day to care for the sick and hungry. These are all resurrection stories and opportunities happening today, right now, in our midst. So on this day, I encourage you to look around and notice where today's resurrection stories are emerging. This doesn't mean you need to ignore what the world is experiencing today, but instead, by sharing the resurrection stories, we help to proclaim that through the resurrection, love has the final word. And because of this, I can honestly and truly say that I celebrate today.